it's dangerous to give a historian something as open. So this was completely subjective. There were lots of runners-up to kind of these wildly creative times in Fort Worth history. First of all, we are still Cowtown. We went through a period in the 1970s where our downtown creatives decided that Cowtown was a hackneyed and overused phrase. And we actually had a campaign locally through the Chamber of Commerce that went, "Now Town, not Cowtown." Like the worst campaign ever created. And as we look now at what kind of that livestock history means to us, it's golden. As we're looking now at more than $300 million worth of renovation going on in the stockyards today, kind of mind-boggling how we've almost come full circle. This is kind of an interesting woodcut. I don't know how many of you can see it around on the side, of one of those iconic longhorn herds moving up from South Texas that really gave Fort Worth its first economic boost. So if we look at kind of the beginning of our creative work in Fort Worth, it was the civic boosters who took this tiny frontier community, and partly because of our location, but mostly because of just civic boosterism, turned Fort Worth into one of the major cattle towns in the history of the West. We were the last provisioning point moving up what is colloquially known now as the Chisholm Trail. Historically, the Chisholm Trail never came into Texas, but that's a story for another time. But out of that came our first economic base, because as the cattle herds moved through, the cowboys bought boots, saddles, hats, clothing, all the food to get them safely up the trail through Indian Territory to the railheads in Kansas. And it also launched the era of one of the greatest red light districts in the history of the United States. Our Hell's Half Acre that basically sat where the convention center is today. In a very real sense, our entertainment district remains today where it has always been in Fort Worth history. But the Longhorn is our mostly official mascot. There was a time, if you remember maybe 20 years ago, the city said, no, we're just not really comfortable with the Longhorn, and they created the worst new logo for the city of Fort Worth. And thankfully, Jim Lane, who was on city council at that point, demanded that Molly, our Longhorn, come back. And I don't think we'll ever lose her again. But we go through these phases where we get somewhat embarrassed of our history and try to change it and shove it under the rug. But I think we're largely past that. I think we are embracing what makes us unique as a city. And some of the stories I'm going to talk about this morning kind of go to the heart of that. Bear in mind that over the next 25 years, the Fort Worth, Dallas, Arlington metro area, 16 counties in North Texas, will become the most populous center in North America. We're heading for a total population of 14 million people. So how do we as a city kind of maintain the history, maintain our stories, and maintain some unique sense of place, in the midst of all of that? So for me, telling the stories repeatedly is critically important. Because as we look at particularly our two cities, Fort Worth and Dallas, we're 30 miles apart geographically, but centuries apart emotionally and historically. And it goes back to a period not long after the first herds moved through, and Fort Worth said, well, why are we sending cattle onto somebody else's railhead? We need to bring the railroad to Fort Worth. In that 3-year period that Dallas had the railroad before we got ours, because of this great national financial panic and recession, Dallas made a very deliberate turn eastward toward business and mercantile, and we're just going to do whatever it takes to grow and be a city. Fort Worth made an equally deliberate look westward toward livestock and agriculture. And when we get to this concept of the cowboy way, of how do you protect yourself, how do you survive on the frontier, Fort Worth, I think, in many ways still maintains that pioneering ethos of we survive by working together. And at least until recently, we haven't devolved into shouting at each other across the dais that we see in so many other cities around the country and certainly around Texas. But I think it goes back to this concept of how do we survive on the frontier? And we only do that by cooperation. It's one of my favorite images of Fort Worth history. This is the first perspective map that we had on Fort Worth. It was published in March of 1876. And it's not only a perspective map, it's a prospective map, because up on the horizon, no buttons, up on the top, you can sort of see a little train coming across on the horizon. Well, by March of 1876, the train was still a vision. It was still parked on the other side, on this side of Dallas. Again, during that period that the railroad was supposed to get here and was delayed. And it shows, you know, our first permanent courthouse, where the courthouse sits today, the Baptist church, the Presbyterian church, the Catholic church, Captain B.B. Paddock's law office right on Weatherford Street across from the courthouse. But what it also shows is all this broad, empty area between the railroad and the bulk of downtown. What do you think was in the middle of all of that broad, empty area that this map, this promotional map was showing? Whorehouses, saloons, and gambling houses.
Different houses.
You know, different kind. Everybody knew it was there, but our first promotional piece, our first kind of creative, effort in Fort Worth, just said, we're just not going to point that out. Okay. So going back to another kind of. Fort Worth has a long history of making lemonade out of lemons. Again, this period when the railroad stopped in Dallas and gave it that 3-year head start, at that point, a former Confederate veteran who had moved to Fort Worth picked up the local newspaper and had the Fort Worth Weekly Democrat, a man named Captain B.B. Paddock, who was basically the Amon Carter of the 19th century. I mean, he was the most prolific supporter of the city, anybody we had during that period. And he put on the masthead of his newspaper this map. It's called the Tarantula Map. And it showed 9 railroads converging on Fort Worth at a time we had none. At a time we may never get any. Some people laughed at it. But the wonderful thing about the Tarantula Map, again, because it sort of looked like a spider, was that 100 some odd years later, when local oilman and businessman Bill Davis brought steam locomotion back with the Tarantula Railroad. He named it in honor of kind of Captain Paddock's vision for what Fort Worth could become. But instead of 9 railroads converging on Fort Worth, we ended up with 11. That intersection of the north-south, east-west tracks, right where I-35 and I-30 converge today on the southeast corner of downtown, is the busiest single rail intersection in the continental United States. Wow. But that vision, in 1873, when the railroad had stopped dead, still allowed Captain Paddock to create something out of whole cloth and then do everything in his power to make it a reality. And it ultimately came to be. Okay. This is an image of a train identical to the one that finally rolled into Fort Worth on July 19th, 1876, finally becoming a reality, finally giving us the opportunity to ship cattle out of Fort Worth instead of just passing them through on the herds. Next one. During that 3-year period, because when people thought the railroad was going to be here in 1873, a lot of people were moving to Fort Worth to take advantage of the economic boom that would naturally come with the railroad's arrival. When the railroad didn't get here, people left as fast as they'd come. There are stories about being able to sit up on the courthouse grounds and look out toward the eastern horizon, see this unbroken chain of campfires as people were leaving the city. It was at that point that a young Dallas attorney who had come to Fort Worth expecting the boom went back, wrote a letter to the Dallas Herald, and basically said things are so quiet now in Fort Worth and dead that a panther could literally sleep unmolested in the middle of Main Street. Designed to be an insult, but what do? We flip it around and the panther becomes our unofficial mascot. So the day the railroad finally arrives in July of 1876, Captain Paddock changes the masthead of his paper and adds this new graphic that says, "Where the panther laid down." It shows the railroad coming in just as the ultimate, thumb our nose at Dallas. And Fort Worth would then become the terminus and dramatically expand all the way up through those 11 rail lines that were coming through. But that where the panther lay down, of course, the panther today we have scattered all over town. This is one of the earliest depictions from the 1907 Flatiron Building downtown at Houston Street and 9th. When it was built by Dr. Bacon Saunders, he memorialized this idea of Fort Worth as Panther City, that we can rise out of any adversity that might be thrown at us. Or scattered around town, Darren Wright's spectacular sleeping panther on the grounds of the county, the Commissioner's Court building. There's another sleeping panther statue down adjacent to the Flatiron building. But you can see a sleeping panther scattered all over, and now we have some 20 companies in Fort Worth that all use the Panther City name, whether it's barbecue, brewing, roofing materials. So the Panther continues, but all coming out of the imagination of Captain Paddock. And how do we turn an insult into an icon? And so that's where the Panther remains today. The next one I picked as one of those wild moments was the Texas Spring Palace. And this was a great promotional effort that was built in Fort Worth to promote all of the goods that were available in Texas. It was a promotional event put together by the Fort Worth and Denver Railroad. And it was built just south of the railroad tracks on Vickery between Jennings Street and South Main. So that today, Galveston and St. Louis, as they come in and dead end into Vickery, those were the two main entrances into the Spring Palace. It opened in the spring of 1889 and was so successful that it was expanded, almost doubled in size, and opened for an 1890 season. This shows going into the 1890 season. And this is a building that was bigger than our Tarrant County Courthouse, not quite as big as the state capitol. It was just an enormous structure built on the south end of downtown. You could see it from almost any point coming into the city. And it was built out of every flammable material you can imagine. So you know where the story is going. Every county in the state had an opportunity to decorate a room. So you look at some of the interior images and hear, popcorn and pea curtains and, all this thatching going in and, built out of East Texas yellow pine. Just, magnificent building. But designed by an early architectural firm called Messrs. Sanguinet and Messer. And we are here today at one of the Messer brothers' houses. They were the architects of record for the original development of Arlington Heights, which got its start in 1889, same year that the Spring Palace was constructed, headquarters in the old land title block, one of our earliest buildings still standing downtown, where the Flying Saucer was before it moved up a block. This house, the carriage house here and the Messer house were part of the original residential development. There are still 5 of the original 19th century Arlington Heights houses remaining. 2 of them over on Bryce Avenue. Fairview, the William Bryce house, who was responsible for actually building many of these houses and much of downtown in the early part of the 20th century. Right along the streetcar line. The streetcar came out of Fort Worth, first bridge across the river, came across 7th Street to accommodate the Arlington Heights line. It would move all the way out up Camp Bowie, take a turn off on Bryce, go to Merrick, and go Merrick straight down to Lake Como, which is just right down below us. It was not only a recreational area, but it provided the water supply for the steam generating plant that provided the electricity for the streetcar line to get people out here. The fact that there are 5 of those houses remaining, I think, is remarkable, considering all the growth and the development pressure. This one was the one in the most serious jeopardy of loss. And 30 years ago, I remember going through the house and ceilings were coming down, spindles were missing in the staircase. And it's been through a couple of ownerships in between the league folks that have it now. And they've done a wonderful job at getting the property back together. Certainly the best advertising spot in the world, being right on the freeway. But this one was completed about 1892, 93, in that earliest phase of development. And if you haven't driven around Lake Como in a while, it's undergone a massive cleanup and renovation, led in many ways by by Brent Hyder, who bought William Bryce's old house and actually took it back to its condition in the 1890s, removing bathrooms and taking the house back to its single original bathroom. I mean, who does that anymore? But Brent has been really keen on promoting the history of Arlington Heights. And that first phase of development was stymied by yet another national recession. And it wouldn't be until well after the turn of the 20th century that Arlington Heights would get its next stage in life, and we'll come back to that story in a little bit. But we're on the grounds of one of the two architects that designed this magnificent spring palace. So on the evening of May 30th, 1890, there were some 6,000 people in the building enjoying the final night. And this huge building was completely engulfed in flames in less than 15 minutes. There were hundreds of injuries, but amazingly only one casualty. There was an Englishman named Alfred Hayne, who had been doing some work for the Fort Worth and Denver Railroad, but he repeatedly went back into the fire to rescue people. He ended up on the second floor, literally, carrying people to the window and dropping them down to rescuers down below. When he finally jumped out of the window, he landed, broke both ankles, and succumbed and died a few hours later at the old St. Joseph's Hospital up in what's now part of the JPS complex on South Main Street. But this is an illustration from Frank Leslie's Illustrated News. It was one of the great news suppliers in the 19th century. The thought was, we'll bring the Spring Palace back, but that national recession that bankrupted the original Arlington Heights development, shut down our first effort toward our own packing plant in Fort Worth, precluded the Spring Palace ever reopening. But that site, for many years, where there's a giant kind of parking, what used to be May Advertising, that site was used as our main public recreation grounds. The circus, when it came to town, would perform there. But 2 years after this fire, they had a national tour of a show called The Last Days of Pompeii. So on the site of one of the wildest fires in American history, we have this great touring show that actually recreates the eruption of Vesuvius and the destruction of Pompeii. So that site itself is remarkable. And sometime there's still some areas in there where there might still be some archaeological opportunity to dig down and figure out where that fire layer is. Because there was a miniature model of the Galveston Island and the shipping way up into Houston. There were artifacts from Sam Houston, relics from the Alamo, all these kind of precious historical items that disappeared and were lost in the fire.
What was it used for?
It was called a carporama. And it was like the spring palaces and the corn palaces that sprang up around the country. It was just designed to promote Texas. And from the railroad's perspective, let's bring all these people in. We're going to run a special railroad line into it. So it was, it was an advertising promotion, a really expensive advertising promotion. But just that thought of, we're going to build this huge structure out on the prairies, ultimately to have this happen to it. But this is the monument to Al Hayne. There was, again, that one casualty in the fire. And it's been moved several times from its original location. But if you're familiar with the Lancaster Corridor, the historic Texas and Pacific Passenger Station and the T&P Lofts, the apartments adjacent to it, there's now a new permanent park, and the Al Hayne is in, I think, a spot where it won't have to ever be moved again. Because it started out in the middle of what would become the right-of-way for Lancaster. It was the big open plaza in front of the original railroad station at 17th and Main. But on this, and you can still see today, even where the limestone has begun to deteriorate, a depiction cut in of the Spring Palace itself. The original bust of Al Hayne was stolen at some point and then recreated by local artist Eveline Sellers, who also did those magnificent bas-reliefs in Farrington Field, and then taught sculpture and work at the Museum of Science, the Children's Museum for many, many years. But the monument is still there. It's one of the 3 original free horse fountains that we had in the city. The one that was on the courthouse grounds was replicated for our city sesquicentennial in 1999. The other one was out at Central and North Main Street. But this is the only one of the originals that still remains. Next creative, our Frontier Centennial. We're all familiar with Casa Mañana now, the 1958 kind of geodesic dome that's down at Lancaster and University. It sits on the site of our 1936 Frontier Centennial. 1936, of course, was the centennial of independence from Mexico. So it was going to be celebrated all over the state. And there was this great competition to figure out where the main celebration would be. Austin knew it would be there because it's the state capital. Well, now it'll be in San Antonio because of the Alamo. Houston knew they had it because of the San Jacinto battlegrounds. It ended up in Dallas. mostly because we're at the beginning of the Great Depression and certainly the economic effects that we were feeling in Texas, but because Dallas had the infrastructure for the state fair. So all of the buildings were there, the grounds were there, access was there. And that's when they converted so many of those early 20th century buildings into that incredible collection of Art Deco architecture that Fair Park represents today. Well, it infuriated Fort Worth. Of course, we had no connection whatsoever to the founding of the Republic of Texas. But Amon Carter, Benny Keith, kind of leaders in the city, just were incensed that it ended up in Dallas. I think they would have been fine in Houston, Austin, or San Antonio, but not Dallas. So Fort Worth actually diverted grant funds that were provided from the federal government that were designed to build our new city-county hospital, what would become eventually JPS Hospital, to create our own centennial grounds in Fort Worth. And the city acquired a huge swath of property just across the river below downtown that was part of the old K.M. Van Zandt farm. Some of you might be aware of the Van Zandt cottage that sits just south of Farrington Field. That's our oldest structure on its original site, and it sat on the old river road coming into and going out of Fort Worth. So we acquired the property down there because it had, of course, streetcar access, kind of an easy way to get to it. And then in what, to me, is one of the most creative coups in Fort Worth history, the Centennial Committee hired a young advertising man named Bill Jerry, whose family had been deeply involved in the origins of the cattle industry in Texas. But they hired him to design what at that point was the largest neon sign ever done in Texas. This great colored sign. It had a cowboy on a bucking bronco. I mean, this amazingly complicated sign that we placed right outside the main gates of Fair Park. So what does this say? Wild and Whoopee, 45 minutes west. And it goes back to a fairly irreverent, view of Fort Worth and its history. We were going to have fun with it, and it goes back to the time that we had celebrated. We take a break a minute because kind of leading into our irreverent look at Fort Worth and kind of tying this back to that idea of our red light district downtown, Hell's Half Acre. We're adjacent over here to Camp Bowie Boulevard. Camp Bowie Boulevard is the original Arlington Heights Boulevard, but it was renamed during World War I when the United States Army took advantage of 2,000 acres that were offered to them to create a training facility for the troops from Texas and Oklahoma who would eventually go to Europe to fight in World War I. The Army said, we appreciate the offer. We would love to take you up on it, but we are not going to bring 100,000 18 and 19-year-old young men to Fort Worth until you do something about your red light district. So what Fort Worth did for the brief period of training while all these young men were here, rounded up as many of the prostitutes as they could find in Fort Worth, and they confined them all into a little building a couple of blocks from the courthouse downtown into what they called a rehabilitation hospital. The building happened to be what was left when H.H. Holmes came to Fort Worth and began to build a replica of his murder castle during the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Story for another time, but the Holmes murder castle version in Fort Worth was where all of those prostitutes were rounded up and kept for the duration of Camp Bowie. But much of that business would end up being squeezed out into other areas, certainly out along what would become Jacksboro Highway and its new title of Thunder Road. And some of it would go out to Arlington, the Top of the Hill Club, now owned by the Bible College out there. But again, back this kind of irreverent look at Fort Worth and a very, I think, realistic look at human nature. Our first economic base was built on vice. Our city's first millionaire was the primary property owner in Hell's Half Acre. So it was vitally important to the city. So by the time we come around and we begin to celebrate our 100th anniversary, our 75th anniversary, the Diamond Jubilee in 1924, this is how we advertised it. Not with some homage to history, but, a scantily clad woman standing in the middle of Main Street with the tower of the courthouse just conveniently placed. I mean, it's, the whole idea of the design of this artwork is remarkable to me. So when it comes time to talk about the Frontier Centennial, Do we change much? Absolutely not. And this artwork done by local artist Jewel Brannon was spectacular at the time. She did most of the official artwork for the Frontier Centennial. So we take all of this money that was supposed to go into a hospital, and we complete first the construction of what's now the Will Rogers Memorial Center. And then we build what were affectionately dubbed at the time Amon's Cow Barns to make way for the Frontier Centennial. So to orient you, you can see the Will Rogers Complex and the Pioneer Tower. The modern Casa Mañana sits right about here. And several years ago, when they were building the John Justin Arena, they excavated that area. They found the original turntable for that original, and it's encapsulated now underneath that parking garage. But what was here, again, the 4,000-seat open amphitheater of the Casa Mañana Theater. There was a kind of reconstructed kind of Frontier Main Street, a theater built to bring the entire Broadway production of Jumbo that Billy Rose had been producing. Of course, you remember the story. Billy Rose was brought to Fort Worth, paid $1,000 a day for 100 days to mount this magnificent production in direct rivalry with what was going on in Dallas. So we had the Pioneer Palace, a reproduction of the fort. They had a daily reenactment of a battle between the soldiers of Fort Worth and the Indians that never in history happened. And then for good measure, we brought in the things that were most historic to Fort Worth, Sally Rand and her nude ranch. And this is a show of, Sally Rand, of course, was the famous fan dancer, performing supposedly naked on stage, covered only by these giant feathers. But the irreverent look of history so offended Dallas that they actually legalized prostitution in the back end of Fair Park for the duration of the Centennial Fair in 1936. Again, this rivalry between the two cities was colossal. But that whole, again, we're just going to create something that has no basis in fact, and we're going to throw a spectacular celebration. The connections between Fort Worth and the federal government at that point, Franklin Roosevelt actually punched a button on his yacht somewhere off the East Coast to turn the lights on and officially open the Fort Worth Frontier Centennial. He had nothing to do with opening, the official fair in Dallas, but only here in Fort Worth. So we move on now. Of course, Casa Mañana would go on for another couple of seasons, closed by the 1938-39 season, and then most of the infrastructure was demolished, and much of the steel construction in the theater was taken, sold for scrap to go into to help us fight in World War I and World War II. This is a shot. I just threw this in because it's one of the most amazing photographs that we have in Fort Worth history. This is of the May of 1949 flood. But you recognize the back end of what's now Montgomery Plaza down off of 7th Street. But I have to wonder, did the horse make it? This horse finding the only place of refuge on the roof of a house there. But in 1949, after the end of World War II, when the city was expecting the economy to collapse, when the war economy slowed down, because one of our major employers, and the employer that had actually taken the distinction of the biggest employment center away from the stockyards during World War II, was what's now Lockheed Martin. When Consolidated Vultee opened its plant and adjacent air base out on the west side on the shores of Lake Worth. And the thought was the city, in anticipating an economic slowdown, passed a massive bond election in 1947 that was expected to build the roads, to do things in the event that the economy collapsed. Well, what was happening in the aftermath of the war was not a closure of the aircraft plant out there, but the work on one of the most secret military projects in the country, and that was the development of the B-36 intercontinental ballistic bomber. So the economy not only didn't suffer, it actually expanded. So the city had this magnificent batch of bond money to do lots of things with. One of the first that came out of that was the creation of a new home for the Children's Museum. This is a museum that had started out in De Zavala Elementary on the south side and then moved into one of the old mansions up on Summit Avenue. but had dramatically outgrown its space. But as we look, and this next batch is really looking at the cultural district, and again, creating something out of nothing. The city had this vast, vast amount of land that it still held onto from the old Frontier Centennial. All this acreage on the west side of town that had great access. And they began in 1949 with this beginning of a partnership where the city is the land partner and moving into joint projects with private foundations and with others. So the very first new construction of what would become the cultural district is this children's museum, and designed by the local firm of Wilson and Patterson. As you look across the cultural district today, most of those buildings are done by world famous, the star architects. But Wilson and Patterson at the time was one of the leading modernist architectural firms in the country, located right here in Fort Worth. So they created with the Children's Museum this magnificent mid-century modern structure, of course with the planetarium in the middle, classroom space, exhibit space. But this is what set the tone for the cultural district that we know today. This is we have the largest concentration of world-class architecture any city frankly, in the world. And it began here with this setting the tone. An image here's the museum. This is an image from 1953. The museum is nearly completed, and you can see under construction the first phase of what would become our new Community Arts Center, which has suffered astonishingly, bad management, I think, under the city. So we're not actually talking about eliminating it. But again, based on the architecture here, we're moving in, and the Fort Worth Art Association brought in Herbert Bayer, who was one of the leading European modernists, a member of the old Bauhaus School of Art and Architecture. It would later be expanded with the Donald Owenschlager and Joe Pellick designed Scott Theater. O'Neill Ford would later come back and change the portico and redo part of the building. So the complex itself, when the city says, well, we want a world-class arts facility, we already have that. And of course, the last organizations are about to move out of it. The building is going to be empty while the city figures out what to do with it. And if you have any influence, now is the time to preserve this complex, because I think it would be incredibly and sadly ironic that the city that instituted this idea of the world's best architecture on this site becomes the first to say, we're going to take it down and we're going to build something not world class. So I think there's a real concern about what eventually is going to happen. But you're familiar, right up in this little triangle up top, it's the site today of the magnificent Austin architectural firm of Fair and Granger's Trinity Lutheran. It was the second, they would start construction about 2 months after this picture was taken. But again, further setting the tone. Fair and Granger was one of the leading modern firms in Texas as well at the time. But out of that would come the 1961 first phase of the Amon Carter Museum on a site that Mr. Carter himself picked before he died in 1955, and eventually the museum done, but of course designed by Philip Johnson, who would then come back and redesign the addition, and then of course the Water Gardens that is fixing to celebrate its 50th year in Fort Worth. In 1972, Louis Kahn's first phase of the Kimball Museum, which we've added now to it with the Renzo Piano Pavilion, then Tadeo Ando's newer Modern Art Museum, as the collection moved out of what's now the Community Arts Center into their new building. But again, it's this incredible collection. Find another city in the world that has this, all within walking distance, all accessible, and all sitting, again, on the grounds, of Sally Rand's former nude ranch. Next, wildly creative. Again, kind of going back a little bit in history, moving on to the stockyards. Again, tracking that history. Her first herd moved up the trail here in 1866. The railroad finally gets here in 1876, so we're now shipping cattle to Chicago and Kansas City. Well, the thought is we need to bring that industry to Fort Worth. We tried our own homegrown packing facility in 1890. It was bankrupted in the same recession that stopped Arlington Heights. But in 1902, we were able to convince 2 of the 4 major meat packers in the country to come operate side-by-side facilities in what today we recognize as the Stockyards National Historic District. The Swift and Armour complexes literally filled the horizon at the top end. Of course, now they're under construction with apartments and retail. And I mean, it's amazing to see what's happening out there now. And the challenge is, how do we not lose the history of the area in the midst of this $300 million renovation? But this is an early image showing the original wooden pens that would burn down in 1911, but the Livestock Exchange building still standing. Of course, Armour up on top of the hill gone. But the only thing remaining up on top is the old Swift and Company headquarters, one of 9 buildings that were acquired by Bob Simpson and his XTO Energy and brought back to life. I mean, an incredible gift to Fort Worth. Of course, as XTO was sold to Exxon, and Exxon moved the XTO operations down to Houston, each of those buildings is now slowly coming back on the market for next life. But if you ever run into Bob Simpson, I mean, we owe him an incredible debt. It was interesting, we had 2 major players in the Barnett Shale in Fort Worth. We had XTO and we had Chesapeake Energy, and 2 incredibly different corporate philosophies. Chesapeake's philosophy was, we're going to buy the land and we're going to scrape it clean. XTO's was, we're going to buy these things and we're going to restore them. I like XTO's position a whole lot better. But what Chesapeake did is, when they bought what was left of the Armour property, they scraped it clean, which of course has left it available for the new construction that's going on up there today. This is an image of the Stockyards in 1953, just after World War II. And to orient you, and here's the Coliseum, the Livestock Exchange building. This is now Stockyards Station, the Drover Hotel right in here, and then the colossal plants of Swift and Armour. But by this time, the Stockyards were already on the decline. These were giant, kind of old school central packing facilities where animals would come in. All these pens up here, 200 acres of livestock pens, were down now to 2 acres. They're all that are left behind the Exchange building. But these were basically gravity-fed systems. The animals would be moved in, taken up these giant chutes to the top floor where the slaughtering process would start, and then basically they would follow the carcass almost all the way down to the basement, each step of the way. That gravity system really spelled the death knell. That, along with World War II, when we were going through gas rationing, rubber rationing, and it was much harder, much more expensive for ranchers to come into these central facilities. And we began to see during the war the development of satellite feedlots and auction houses and smaller markets. So that when the war was over, there was almost an immediate shift on how do we save this giant industry that's in Fort Worth. And it ultimately was a losing battle. Swift and Armour would both close their plants here in the 60s and 70s. At one time, there was an idea to take what had been the Stockyards, scrape it all clean, and just turn this into the city's industrial zone. And it was already largely there. When the Stockyards moved out to this site from the southeast corner of downtown in 1887, of course, Marine Creek runs through the middle of it. Over the course of the 75 years the Stockyards were here, almost 125 million animals were processed through here. But in the early years, of course, what's going to happen to all the effluent coming out of those stockyards? It flowed into Marine Creek, into the Trinity River, and down to our friends in Dallas, which was, not a bad deal for us. But by the 1920s, when the State Health Department did a study of the Trinity River, they found there was not a living adult fish until 60 miles below Dallas. I mean, we did everything we could to pollute the river. That would lead the Stockyards to create the first water treatment facility in Texas. So a lot of innovations would come out of that. But as the area began to slow down, and again during World War II, the workforce shifted from the Stockyards out to the bomber plant. The new marketing campaign. In 1953, the same year that big picture was taken, and I think the future of the Stockyards was pretty clear. They formed the North Fort Worth Businessmen's Association at the time and launched a campaign that would plant the seeds for creating the incredible tourism center that we have today. But it all goes back to those wild frontier days. This is how we advertised and promoted Fort Worth. Get that down. Come to the stockyards. Come see our Wild West. Of course, what that's turned into is a gold mine. Of course, the world's only municipally owned longhorn herd, every day at 11:30 and 4 o'clock. And when you go out there and stand on the street, you're in the middle of 25 different languages. I mean, it is amazing to see what this has brought to Fort Worth. And again, the challenge now with the Hickman Majestic partnership is how do we keep that history and not let it be completely subsumed in the redevelopment. I think they're aware, I mean, how much of a golden goose this is and how fragile it is. But it's a challenge. They're about to develop all of that area north of Billy Bob's, all the parking lots between Billy Bob's and 28th Street. And that's the next, I think, $140, $150 million phase of development. So I had a couple of runner-ups to the most creative periods. And one, of course, was the bomber plant on the east side. It opened in 1942, largely at the insistence of Amon Carter and other civic leaders, because there were, Convair was building plants. There was going to be one in Alabama, there was going to be one in Tulsa. But Mr. Carter went one step further, again, always with a marketing mind. And he came to Fort Worth, after selling chicken sandwiches on the railroad, coming out in and out of his hometown in Bowie, came to Fort Worth and became the advertising manager for the Fort Worth Star, which is this tiny little newspaper, going head to head with the leading newspaper at the time, the Telegram. And eventually the Star, thanks mostly to Amon Carter's advertising genius, eventually bought the Telegram, merged them, and would become one of the largest newspapers with circulation in the country for a lot of its history. But he insisted that an additional 25 feet be added to the end of this plant so that we could tout in Fort Worth the largest aircraft manufacturing facility in the world. And that's exactly what we did. So again, let's just make it up. Just pull it out of whole cloth. The other one was the Trinity River. We had a picture earlier of the 1949 flood. That was the worst. We had started trying to deal with flood control all the way back to the days after the 1908 flood, which remains the worst one in Dallas's history. You go to Dallas and those huge viaducts on the east side of town, on the west side of town.
Well, that's East Fort Worth. Yeah,
exactly. But they were built to accommodate what had been the flood boundaries in 1908. Remains their worst flood. So we started beginning to channelize the river, building levees, trying to control it. Lost complete control for that 49 flood, and that led to the Fort Worth Floodway project that basically eliminated the Trinity River in its original form. The Corps of Engineers came through and they eliminated all of the oxbows and the meanders, cut these giant channels, so that the river we see today is largely the result of that. When they were done, there was not enough water left in the river to even call it a river. It was just this embarrassing scar and drainage ditch through the middle of the city. And we went from that to the effort of, certainly these two ladies, this is Susie Williams and Phyllis Tilley, and the creation of the organization still going today with Streams and Valleys. I mean, a lot of you probably know Stacy Pierce because she's another one of those mind-bogglingly energetic Fort Worthians. But their goal was to basically rebuild a river. First stage was doing those low water dams so that at least there was an opportunity to create constant level of water in the river. That would lead to the trail, the first 1.5 miles of concrete trail and tree planting in what's now Trinity Park, into now one of the greatest linear park systems in the country. I think we're about to connect our system with Arlington's. Eventually that will connect on the other side to Dallas's, so that over the next few years, you'll eventually be able to start at Lake Worth and the Trinity Trail system there and go all the way to White Rock Lake. I mean, it's an amazing interconnected system. So, again, a pretty good runner-up. Of course, Panther Island. Talking to Debbie earlier, we've tended to connect Panther Island to every section of the city, and Debbie is doing her best to make sure, wait a minute, Riverside, which is the original, river-oriented development, needs to be a part of that picture. But we're about to double the size of the Central Business District and create kind of a water feature second to none in the city. A lot of people liken it to the Riverwalk in San Antonio. This will be bigger, it's more open. But when the diversion channel is finally completed, as you see across the top, and we create the constant level lake below the courthouse, you'll be able to go down to Panther Island, pick up a water taxi, go all the way around that lake up into Marine Creek and into the back of the Drovers Hotel. I mean, it's going to be a pretty amazing amenity for the city. And Panther Island itself, the plan still calls for interlacing it with canals and waterways. It's going to be amazing when it is ultimately completed. So, the future for the city, I think, is pretty good. But I think maintaining our sense of humor about where we are. I think one of the silliest arguments we've had lately was, the little dust up over a Hooters downtown. I mean, of all the things to be upset about, given our history, we can't lose that sense of humor. It's what sets us apart, and it's what kept us alive on the frontier, and it's what will keep us, I think, a unique component of this eventual 14 million population center.